It was an ordinary Tuesday evening when Olivia, a young nurse, arrived for her night shift at St. Gabriel's Hospital. The hospital was large, with a mix of old and new buildings. Some parts of the hospital were modern, while others were decades old and looked like they hadn't changed much since the 1950s. Olivia had worked here for almost a year, and although she loved her job, she had heard rumors about certain parts of the hospital that were off limits. One of those places was the old ward on the far side of the hospital. It was known as Ward 49. No one ever talked about it much, and no one ever worked there. The lights were often dim, and the air was always heavy with a sense of neglect. Nurses and doctors who had worked at St. Gabriel's for years said that Ward 49 was a place filled with strange occurrences, things that couldn't be explained. Olivia had heard stories, but she never really believed them. She was a practical person, and she thought there must be some logical explanation for whatever had happened there in the past. But she didn't deny that there was something unsettling about the place. Her shift started at 7 p.m., and she was quickly assigned to the emergency room for the night. It was a busy evening, with patients coming in for various reasons, some with injuries, some with illnesses, and some just needing a place to rest. The hours flew by as Olivia took care of her patients, giving them medicine, making sure they were comfortable, and providing reassurance to the worried families who visited. Around midnight, Olivia was finishing up a report when she noticed something strange. The hospital was unusually quiet. The usual noise of beeping machines and murmuring voices was gone. She looked at the clock on the wall. It had just struck 12:15 a.m. She couldn't remember the last time the hospital had felt so still. A chill ran through her. She shook it off, blaming it on the cold air coming from the air conditioner. But there was something more, something that made her feel uneasy. She felt as if someone was watching her, but when she glanced around the room, she was alone. Suddenly, the phone at the nurse's station rang. Olivia jumped, startled by the sound breaking the silence. "Hello?" Olivia answered, trying to sound calm. There was no response at first, only a faint, slow breathing on the other end. Then, a low voice whispered, "Come to Ward 49. Olivia's heart skipped a beat. The voice was soft and hoarse, almost as if it came from someone who hadn't spoken in years. "Who is this?" Olivia asked, her voice trembling slightly, but the line went dead before she could get an answer. She stood there for a moment, staring at the phone. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She felt an overwhelming urge to go to Ward 49, but she hesitated. It was a part of the hospital she had never been to, and it was known for being off limits. Nurses and doctors who worked there years ago had told stories of strange happenings, people disappearing, rooms filled with strange sounds, and patients who would stare at you with eyes that were far too old. Despite her fear, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to go there. She had no idea why, but something inside her told her that the call was meant for her. She grabbed her flashlight and coat and made her way through the hospital. As she walked through the dimly lit hallways, she felt the air grow colder. The lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the walls. Olivia's steps echoed in the empty corridor, and the silence made her feel like she was walking in a dream. The hospital seemed different tonight, like it was alive with hidden secrets. When she reached the door to Ward 49, Olivia hesitated. The door was old and rusty, with peeling paint. The metal handle was cold to the touch as she grabbed it. She turned the knob and pushed the door open. A musty smell hit her immediately. Stale air, dust, and something else. Something she couldn't quite place. The room was dark, with only a few dim lights hanging from the ceiling. The walls were cracked and yellowed with age. As Olivia stepped inside, she could hear the faint sound of something moving in the shadows, rustling, like paper being crumpled. Her flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing old hospital beds covered in white sheets, some of which were stained with dark spots. She felt a wave of unease wash over her. The place was empty, no patients, no staff, just abandoned furniture and a thick layer of dust that told her this ward had been left untouched for years. Suddenly she heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, like someone was speaking in the room with her. Olivia froze, trying to locate the source of the sound. The whisper wasn't coming from any particular direction. It seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. "Help me." Olivia's breath caught in her throat. The voice sounded like it was calling her name. "Olivia," the voice whispered again, this time clearer than before. Her heart began to race. She turned around, shining the flashlight in every direction. But there was no one there, just the empty beds, the old medical equipment, and the forgotten dust. "Is someone there?" Olivia called out, her voice shaky. There was no answer, just the silence stretching out into the darkness. Olivia turned back to the door, ready to leave, but then she noticed something strange. One of the beds, near the back of the room, was moving. The sheets were rustling as if someone or something was lying there. A feeling of dread washed over Olivia. She took a slow step forward, her flashlight beam shaking as she aimed it at the bed. The rustling stopped. Everything was still again. "Hello?" Olivia called, her voice barely above a whisper. She walked closer to the bed, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She reached the bed and pulled back the sheets. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw the figure lying there. It was a woman. She was pale and thin, her skin almost translucent. Her hair was long and tangled, falling over her face. Her body was twisted at an unnatural angle, as though it had been contorted in pain. But the most disturbing thing about her was her eyes. Her eyes were wide open, staring at Olivia, but they weren't alive. They were empty, like two dark pits, and they seemed to follow her every movement. Olivia stumbled back in shock, nearly falling over. The woman's lips parted slowly, as though she was about to speak, but no words came out. The air grew colder, and Olivia felt as if the room itself was closing in on her. She wanted to run, but her legs felt like they were made of stone. She was frozen in place, unable to tear her eyes away from the woman's empty gaze. Suddenly, the woman sat up with an unnatural speed. Olivia gasped and stumbled backward. The woman's body jerked and twisted as she stood up from the bed. Her movements were stiff and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Olivia could barely breathe. She turned and ran, her footsteps pounding against the floor as she rushed toward the door. But before she could reach it, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Olivia's heart raced as she turned around to face the woman. The woman was standing in front of her now, her face twisted in a grotesque grin. She stretched her arms out, her fingers curled like claws. Olivia felt her throat tighten, her chest constricting with fear. The woman opened her mouth, revealing rows of sharp teeth. "Leave," the woman hissed, her voice now guttural and filled with malice. Olivia didn't wait another second. She ran toward the window, trying to find an escape, but the window wouldn't budge. The room was closing in on her, and she felt like she was suffocating. In that moment, she knew she had to get out. She couldn't stay here any longer. She pounded on the window, screaming for help, but no one came. The woman's voice echoed in the darkness, taunting her. "You should never have come." Olivia's vision blurred as she gasped for air. The room seemed to spin around her, and she felt herself losing consciousness. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the woman's dark eyes, staring at her, empty and full of hate. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when Sarah decided to visit her grandmother in the hospital. Her grandmother, who everyone called Nana, had been sick for a while. She had been in and out of the hospital for months, but this time, things felt different. The doctors said they were doing everything they could, but there was something about the place that made Sarah uneasy. The hospital where Nana stayed was old, with long, narrow hallways and dim lighting. The floors creaked as you walked, and the air smelled of antiseptic mixed with a faint, lingering odor of old wood and dust. The building had been around for decades, and it had that musty, forgotten feel. It was as though the hospital itself had seen things it wasn't supposed to. When Sarah walked through the hospital's front doors, she felt a chill run down her spine. The receptionist greeted her with a kind smile, but there was something off about the way she looked at her. It was almost as if the woman knew Sarah was about to see something she wasn't supposed to. "Your grandmother is in room 312, the receptionist said. "Take the elevator to the 3rd floor. It's quiet up there today." Sarah nodded and made her way to the elevator. As she pressed the button to go up, she noticed a group of nurses walking past her. They were whispering to each other in hushed tones. Sarah tried to catch a few words, but they stopped talking the moment she looked at them. The whole place felt tense, like something was wrong, but no one was willing to say it out loud. The elevator dinged, and Sarah stepped out onto the 3rd floor. It was quieter here than the rest of the hospital. The air felt heavier, as if the floors were holding on to old secrets. Room 312 was at the end of the hall, and Sarah's footsteps echoed as she made her way down. When she reached Nana's room, the door was slightly ajar. Sarah knocked gently before pushing it open. Nana was lying in bed, looking frail and pale, with a thin blanket pulled up to her chin. She smiled weakly when she saw Sarah. "Hello, my dear," Nana whispered. Her voice was soft, and it seemed like it took all her strength to speak. "Hi, Nana," Sarah said, sitting down beside her. "How are you feeling today?" "I'm tired, but I'll be okay," Nana replied. There was a faint smile on her face, but Sarah could see the worry in her eyes. They talked for a while, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The longer she stayed, the more the air in the room seemed to grow thick with an unnatural silence. The soft hum of the machines by Nana's bed was the only sound, and it seemed almost too loud. Just as Sarah was about to ask if Nana needed anything, a nurse entered the room. She was tall, with pale skin and long dark hair. Her eyes were cold, almost glassy, and she didn't smile when she greeted Sarah. "How is she today?" the nurse asked, in a monotone voice, glancing at Nana as if she were just another patient to care for. "She's doing okay," Sarah said, unsure of why the nurse seemed so distant. The nurse nodded and began adjusting the machines by Nana's bed. Sarah felt an odd unease as the nurse worked in silence, her movements stiff and mechanical. Something about her presence made the room feel even colder, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Before Sarah could ask the nurse any questions, she turned and left without saying another word. The door clicked shut behind her, and the room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Is she always like that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. To the door. She didn't answer right away, as if she were unsure whether to speak the truth. Finally, she whispered, "There are strange things that happen on this floor. I've heard things I can't explain." Sarah frowned. "What kind of things, Nana?" Nana hesitated, glancing around as if checking to make sure no one was listening. "Whispers. I hear whispers at night. They come from the walls. Sometimes I think I hear footsteps, but when I look, no one is there." Sarah shivered. "That sounds scary." "It is," Nana replied, her voice barely a whisper. "But that's not the worst of it. There are things in this hospital, things that aren't human. I've seen them. In the hallways, in the corners of my room." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She didn't want to believe her grandmother, but the way she spoke, with such fear in her eyes, made her question everything. Sarah glanced nervously around the room, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. "I'm sure it's just your mind playing tricks on you," Sarah said, trying to reassure her grandmother, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. Nana didn't reply. She just closed her eyes and drifted off to sleep, her breathing shallow. Feeling unsettled, Sarah decided to leave the room for a while. She needed a break from the heavy atmosphere of the hospital. As she stepped out into the hallway, she noticed the same nurse from earlier walking down the corridor. Her eyes seemed to follow Sarah as she passed, but she didn't say anything. There was something unsettling about the nurse's gaze, as though she knew more than she was letting on. Sarah turned a corner and walked down another hallway, hoping to find a bit of peace, but the further she went, the more she realized something was off. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, and the lights flickered as if the building itself were beginning to fall apart. She paused, feeling a strange compulsion to look back, but when she did, there was nothing behind her, just an empty corridor stretching into darkness. Suddenly, she heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, like a distant murmur, but as she listened more closely, she could make out the words, "Help me, help me." The voice sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She looked around, but there was no one in sight. The hallway was empty, just like the rest of the hospital. The whispering continued, growing louder. Coming from one of the rooms ahead, it sounded desperate, like someone in pain. Sarah's heart raced, and she found herself walking toward the sound, unable to stop herself. As she neared the door, the whispering stopped abruptly. She reached out and touched the doorknob. It was cold to the touch. When she opened the door, the room inside was empty. There were no patients, no nurses, nothing but an old hospital bed and equipment that hadn't been used in years. But the walls were covered in scratches, deep gouges that looked like they had been made by something large and desperate. As Sarah stepped inside, she felt a strange pull, an overwhelming urge to look at the far corner of the room. There, in the shadows, something moved. It was like a dark shape, but it didn't seem entirely solid. It shifted, flickered, and then, with a sound like a distant scream, it disappeared. Sarah stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat. She slammed the door shut and ran back down the hallway, not stopping until she was back at Nana's room. Nana was still asleep, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her back. The hospital, the whole building, felt alive in a way it shouldn't. The walls whispered, and the floors creaked with the weight of things that weren't human. When Sarah left later that evening, the rain was coming down harder than ever. As she stepped into her car, she glanced back at the hospital. For a moment, she thought she saw something in the window of Nana's room, something watching her. But when she blinked, it was gone. From that day on, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the hospital had been hiding something, and as much as she wanted to forget, she couldn't. She knew that something dark lived in the walls of that place, and it was waiting for the next person to hear its whispers.